Okay, morning everyone. When I became managing director of Manchester Airport almost 3 years ago, little did I know that I'd spend a lot of my time not talking about aeroplanes or runways or terminal buildings, and I'd spend quite a lot of it talking about other modes of transport. We are quite excited, there we go, to have my slides appear on the screen. Quite excited because in Greater Manchester, our GTI, which stands for Ground Transport Interchange, is the fourth busiest station in Greater Manchester and has 4 million passengers travelling through it every year, which sounds quite impressive, but actually is a bit woeful, if I'm honest. If you compare Manchester Airport with any London airport, 40% of the passengers at a London airport will arrive by public transport. And in Manchester, we have now 31 million passengers travelling through the airport, only 4 million using the GTI. So the mathematical geniuses amongst you will have figured out that's something like 14% of our passengers. So I'm on a mission to drive that number up. Now, driving it all the way up to 40% is going to be the work of, I suspect, more than just me, and is definitely going to need some very significant transport investment. But at the very least, we are going to try and drive that number back up to where it was in 2019, which is more like 19-20%. And so the question is, well, how are we going to do that? On the screen, you have our kind of local network, and actually Manchester Airport is really well located in the context of what Andy Burnham is doing in Greater Manchester with transport. So out of that GTI, Ground Transport Interchange, you can get a bus, and as of early January, that bus is now on the B network, and later in March, you'll be able to tap on and off that bus using a credit card, just like you can in London. And also at the end of March, you'll be able to get on a tram in that GTI and take a tram into the centre of Manchester. In the coloured pink and yellow lines, you also see that Andy has plans for bringing the trains into that same B network and having them be tap on, tap off as well. And so by 28, the thick yellow, and by 2030, the thin pink lines all become part of that same B network, and it starts to feel quite a lot like a London oyster zone world, although we really try not to make the London comparison because we love Manchester and it's considerably better. So that's the kind of local context. But in the end, that's really about getting the 20,000 people that work at the airport back and forth to it. The local context isn't so much about passengers. If I think about passengers, well, then I need to start thinking a little bit more regionally. On the left are all of the places that you can get to by train from Manchester Airport, and that looks like a pretty decent list of the sort of places you'd expect to be able to travel to. Liverpool, Leeds, York, Sheffield, even Edinburgh and Glasgow. The bit that's missing from the chart on the left, though, is how long it takes you. And I did a little test yesterday, and we sat with Google Maps and typed in Manchester Airport to York, and it said, yeah, no problem at all. It'll take you the best part of 2 hours, and you take a train from Manchester Airport to Manchester Piccadilly. You walk from Manchester Piccadilly to Manchester Victoria, and then you get on another train that takes you to York. Now that will be an enthusiastic day out for the most athletic. If you imagine you're going on holiday with 2 children, a partner, and 4 hold baggage suitcases, the idea of taking a train from York to Manchester Victoria, walking from Manchester Victoria to Manchester Piccadilly with the 2 children dragging their little chunky cases behind them, and then getting on another train at Manchester Piccadilly, you aren't going to do that. You're going to drive. And that is Manchester Airport's challenge in the context of its public transport infrastructure. The chart on the right lays that to bear. This red line and this pink line represent the 1 hour and the 2 hour drive times and how far you can get in a car. And the coloured blocks that's shaded, that's how far you can get on a train. And essentially what that says is, where you can drive to in an hour, it takes you 2, and where you can drive to in 2 hours, you're in for the long haul. Which is why I'm very enthusiastic about the Liverpool-Manchester Railway that Andy Burnham and Steve Rotherham invited me to join the board of. And we've been talking about building new railways in the north for some time, and I fear we've got some more talking to do, but eventually somebody might get a spade and start digging some holes and actually creating a railway. If I take that Liverpool example, it's 39 miles to Liverpool Port from Manchester Airport, and it's about an hour and a quarter, hour and a half by train. The difference between Schiphol Airport in Amsterdam and Rotterdam Port is about 39 miles. Guesses from the audience how long that takes by train? 15 minutes, almost. I think it's 20, but you get the idea, right? So 20 minutes Amsterdam to Rotterdam Port, hour and a quarter Manchester Airport to Liverpool Port. We definitely need to sort out our rail infrastructure. And if we do, by beginning that railway line between Liverpool and Manchester via Warrington, via Manchester Airport, then you start to open up a whole new world of transport. Because that railway station could, in the future, connect you to Birmingham via a HS2 extension. It could connect you east. So as rather than taking your children and these suitcases from Manchester Piccadilly to Manchester Victoria, you actually have a direct connection that runs through the centre of Manchester and out to Leeds, to York, to Sheffield. If I talk about GVA, gross value added, £500 million gets to Liverpool from Manchester Airport, and about 50 million gets to Sheffield. Why is that? Well, because I've moaned about the public transport connections to Liverpool, but you can at least drive there sensibly. To get to Sheffield, even driving there is a mission. And you can see that happen in the economics. A tenth of the GVA that goes to Liverpool goes to Sheffield, despite the fact it is also 39 miles from Manchester Airport. But the difference in the GVA flows is all about the transport infrastructure. I am the managing director of Manchester Airport, however, so I will now talk a little bit about airports and what great things they are for the United Kingdom, never mind the North. Today we generate £6-7 billion worth of GVA, and I said £500 million of it goes to Liverpool, and a very decent chunk of it ends up in Greater Manchester. If you go out 25 years to 2050, we think that 6-7 could become 18-19 billion. You could double the number of passengers that we have from 31 million up to 60 million. And actually, there's been a lot of talk in the news recently about airport expansion. By and large, we are done. We have 2 runways, they're there already. The terminal work that we are doing now, creating this award-winning Terminal 2, is good for 45-50 million passengers. So we could absolutely be growing Manchester Airport, and we are, and that route map is intended to show you all the places that we're looking to grow to. And we are not done. There are 5 places, Lahore, Islamabad, Delhi, Mumbai, Bangkok, all of which have 200,000-300,000 passengers flying to them indirectly from Manchester Airport every year. And for anyone to make a long-haul service work, any airline, they're looking for 100,000. So you've got 2 or 3 times the number of passengers you need in order to make these long-haul services work. And all I then need to do is to have Boeing and Airbus start putting aircraft together a bit quicker, so as the airlines actually have enough aircraft to then fly these routes, and then I'd have lots more arrows pointing to all the new locations that we would get to. You look at that maths that takes you to 18 billion, 19 billion in 2050 with 60 million passengers. That's an extra 50 connections from Manchester Airport. Today there are 200 different places you can fly to from Manchester Airport. That would make it 250. And it has all the places on it that you would imagine you would want to fly to that you can't get to today. So that's probably where I will wrap up. In conclusion, today Manchester Airport has a woeful number of its passengers travelling by public transport. The reason for that is not because I'm a bad person, it's because the transport infrastructure of the north really needs investment. In the short term, we're doing work with Andy Burnham, B Network, getting trains in, trams, buses. That will help. That will definitely get me from the 15 to the 20%. But if we want to move on and connect to some of those big city locations that I've named, Liverpool, Leeds, Sheffield, then you need to start investing properly in some real transport infrastructure that opens up the world and starts to share what is now 7 billion and could be 19 billion pounds worth of GVA across the whole of the north of the UK. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Chris. Now, I am keen to get, again, questions from the audience, but I did want to start off simply by asking you to get your thoughts on what you think the role of airports play in supporting sustainable and multimodal transport options. What are your thoughts on that?
So if you're doing a risk assessment on the future of aviation, then the big challenge ahead of you is the climate and carbon in particular. So if you're an airport, you have to be doing absolutely all that you possibly can to get your carbon act together and also helping to make sure that both the people travelling to your airport and the aircraft that are travelling from your airport are doing exactly the same thing. So if we start with the 15 to 20% of our passengers ending up on public transport, and you look at the work Andy's doing in Greater Manchester to bring the buses to become electric vehicles, the trams and the trains clearly already are, so that definitely helps. Then you go to the airport yourself and you say, okay, well, what are we doing? All of our electricity is zero carbon, and when you start to look at how we heat the airport, today it's using methane. Well, we're just starting to procure biomethane, so as we can actually have carbon zero methane to heat the airport. But we're also looking a little bit further out at some crazy ideas like drilling a big hole and finding some hot water under it and using that to heat the airport rather than using any methane at all. So that gets my scope 1 and 2 carbon into decent shape in time for 2038, which is when Manchester City have said they want all of their work to be net zero. And then you look to the aircraft, and if I said earlier that as Manchester Airport's managing director, the thing that I've done more of than I was expecting was talking about transport, my other soapbox topic is sustainable aviation fuels. And on the Wirral, there's a site where you could build a sustainable aviation fuel plant, and you could take Greater Manchester's black bin bag waste, throw it in the front door of this plant, and then with what I'll just call magic, out the back of this plant comes enough sustainable aviation fuel to power all of Manchester Airport's aircraft. So you take the black bin bag waste from Greater Manchester in the front door and all of our fuel out the back. The complete circular use of that carbon, which then gets Manchester Airport into a place where we're well on our way to a 2050 net zero target for sustainable aviation fuel and for aircraft.
Fantastic, thank you. I do want to take some questions if you have any burning questions that you would like to ask. Yes, sir, please do.
So that sounds like a great idea. We had a gentleman on the stage talking about decision making and how it can take a little bit of time. So what is in the way of that happening? Our waste going in the front door and your aviation fuel coming out the back?
So there are two things. One is what they call the waste hierarchy. So DEFRA actually today don't prioritise waste being recycled into sustainable aviation fuel. And our view is that they should, for the very logical reasons that I've just described. Why would you be incinerating Greater Manchester's waste today, which is what happens? Why wouldn't you instead be feeding it into a plant and turning it into sustainable aviation fuel? That seems to make a lot of sense. And so we're pretty confident that DEFRA will change its waste hierarchy rules in the coming months, maybe a year, to incentivise the UK to drive its waste into those sort of facilities where they exist. And then the second piece is, well, I've just said where they exist, so how is it that you get somebody to fund building one? That sustainable aviation fuel plant is probably good for the best part of £1 billion worth of GVA to the North economy in its own right. So why wouldn't we want to get on with building it? And the challenge is having certainty around the price that you can sell that sustainable aviation fuel at. Because everyone knows it's more expensive than fossil fuel-based jet fuel, so why would somebody buy it? In the King's Speech, the government have legislated that airlines need to use 2, then 4, then 6, then 8, then 10% of their fuel being sustainable aviation fuel, but today it's all shipped from the US or from Amsterdam. What we need is what's called a price stability mechanism, which again is government legislated, that means that as an investor, you know that you've got a strike price that you're going to be able to sell your sustainable aviation fuel at. And now you've got all the pieces in place, all the building blocks to get on with building that plant and starting to divert that waste stream. And so again, we are confident that this year, 2025, we should see that legislation work its way through and start to get investors into a place where they're confident that they can start to build these facilities. And by the end of the 2020s, actually, rather than importing this sustainable aviation fuel from Amsterdam and from America, probably on ships powered by diesel that isn't biodiesel, instead you build it on the Wirral with the pipe to Manchester Airport directly underneath the facility, so as it's absolutely perfectly sited, ready to be used.
Perfect. Thank you, Chris. Unfortunately, that's all we have time for this morning.
No problem.
But we really appreciate your time because I know that you're very, very busy. Let's thank Chris Woodroofe, everybody. Thank you,
very much.
Chris. Thank you.